Good morning, Eden. It is so good to be with you guys again. We are back with episode 23. If you are new, go back and listen to the other 22 episodes. But if not, my name is Josh Stothers. This is Josh Carney. We are both pastors and chaplains. We are passionate about helping everybody wake up to the way that God sees the world. And so that's where this name, Good Morning Eden, comes from, because we want to wake ourselves up to like that Eden way of life back in Genesis 1 and 2. And we're doing that by going through the Gospel of Mark. So we're up to Mark chapter 14, verses 43 through to chapter 15, verse 20. Big chunk of scripture today. But yeah, this is our third last episode of season 1. So crazy. Let's just tuck into it. Josh, do you want to take it away and read for us?
Let's do it.
Thank you.
Verse 43, I'm reading in the NIV. Yep, sweet. So it says, just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and the teachers of the law and the elders. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard. Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you did not arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. There he sat with the guards and warmed himself at a fire. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days will build another not made with hands. Yet even then their testimony did not agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men bring against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, Jesus said. And you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit on him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You were also with the Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you are talking about, he said. And he went into the entryway. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you are one of them, for you are Galilean. He began to call down curses and swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time. Then Peter remembered the words that Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders and the teachers of the law and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. They bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. Are you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate. You have said so, Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So Pilate again asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of. But Jesus still made no effort to reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barnabas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. Do you want me to release you the king of the Jews? Asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed over Jesus to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. What shall I do then? with the one called the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" Pilate asked. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him. And they began to call out to him, "Hail the King of the Jews." Again and again they struck him on his head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him. And when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. Sweet.
Heavy stuff.
Heavy, heavy, heavy.
Yeah. Well, do you want to help us unpack it? There's a lot. I mean, it's a lot that happened, but at the same time, it's not that much.
Yeah.
You know, like it's a lot of scripture, but it's really, this whole thing is just like Jesus being betrayed and then kind of going through the judicial process that leads you to be, and then getting mocked, I guess, by the soldiers. So kind of 3 phases, or 4, because there's sort of 2 judicial processes and then Peter disowning. So do you want to walk us through that end of chapter 14 from verse 43?
Yeah, sure thing.
Talk about when he got arrested and help us understand it, Josh.
I'll do my best.
Okay.
But the context of where we find ourselves is Jesus had just finished his prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he just said, "Hey, Father, let your will be done." And that is when you get the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. And so basically you get the Sanhedrin coming to come and arrest Jesus with Judas. And the Gospel of John also records, it doesn't record it in Mark, but the Gospel of John records that a cohort of Roman soldiers come as well. And a cohort was a tenth of a Roman legion, so around 600 soldiers.
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
That's a lot.
To arrest one dude.
Yep. And it kind of makes sense why Jesus is like, "Hey, am I leading a rebellion that you come out with all these like swords and clubs?"
You imagine being one of those 600 guys, thinking you're about to go to war, and then you come up this hill and there's like 11 people,
100%.
half of whom are asleep. You know, wow. Okay,
100%. And so there's around 600 soldiers. You get the members of the Sanhedrin there, and they're being led by Judas. And so Judas comes and he betrays Jesus with a kiss. And James Edwards says the idea that Jesus was betrayed with a kiss is somewhat puzzling, because there's not really many records of disciples, like kissing their rabbis on the cheek like Judas did here. But one allusion to the Old Testament could be something in 2 Samuel chapter 20, where Joab, who is one of King David's like soldiers, kind of up there soldiers, there was, in the context of 2 Samuel chapter 20 is there was a man called Amasa, and Amasa kind of sided with one of David's enemies. And so Joab had an encounter with him, and he went and said, "Hey, come and like greet me." And so he went over, and scripture says he touched his beard to kiss him, and as he was going to kiss him, he got a dagger and stabbed him to death.
Cool.
And so, the allusion there is like an act of love was performed for a mission of hate. That's what James Edwards said about what occurred to Amasa in 2 Samuel by Joab. And it could be an allusion to what's happening here. This act of love, which is a kiss, is actually performed for a mission of hate and evil, which is really sad, which is really sad. And so, then what happens is one of Jesus' disciples comes and cuts off the ear of one of the servants of the high priest. And Mark doesn't say who it is, but John identifies that person as Peter. And Luke adds a little bit more to the story as well by talking about how, the disciples, they were armed at that time. Perhaps because they thought that this may be the night that Jesus was leading his rebellion against the Roman authorities, which definitely didn't happen. And so Jesus surrendered, and after he surrendered, all of the disciples deserted him. And it fulfills what Jesus said back in verse 27 of chapter 14, that the disciples would desert him. And it's sad because they all drank the cup of the new covenant. They all ate of the bread of the new covenant. They all pledged to die with him in verse chapter 31, but none of them actually stayed true to their word. And that's the great tragedy of this section of the passage.
Yeah.
But something that I really wanted to focus on today in this particular passage is the naked man. The naked man is so random.
Yeah,
It's so random. And so everything else is kind of self-explanatory, but I wanted to spend a bit of time about this streaker. Because, James Edwards, he made me laugh. He said, we have the curious first recorded streaker in history. And so this naked man, in verse 51, it says, a young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled, leaving his garment behind. Super random. Only Mark refers to this. And so there are a couple of people that actually believe that this may be Mark himself as the author of the gospel. He was around Jesus and around the disciples, hence why he knew so many of the stories of Jesus and the disciples. Right. And so some people believe that this could be Mark putting his kind of signature in the book, saying like, even I'm here and I'm one of the people that deserted Jesus. But the reality is James Edwards and Big Laz, Larry Hurtado shared, even though it could be Mark, it could be Mark, it doesn't actually matter because to speculate is pointless. There's only 2 verses about this guy in the whole Bible. But they say that, even though the identity of the man isn't extremely clear, he's there for a purpose. And so reason number 1 is it could be a possible allusion to Amos chapter 2, verse 16, because in Amos chapter 2, verse 16, it says, even the bravest of warriors will flee naked on that day, declares the Lord. And it could be an allusion, this naked character could be an allusion of the fact that prophecy was being fulfilled. Even the bravest disciples that declared, hey, we're going to stand by you no matter what, they are actually people that deserted Jesus. And it's fulfilling the prophecy in Amos chapter 2. Larry Hurtado says, further, it's interesting to compare the scene of the young man's flight coming at the beginning of the events leading up to Jesus' execution, because the young man unknowingly anticipates the burial of Jesus. This young man runs away, leaving his linen cloth, while Jesus goes to his death to be buried in another cloth that is linen itself.
Whoa!
Yeah, and perhaps it's a dramatic portrayal of the substitutionary nature of Jesus' death. So essentially, this guy, Mark points out that he's wearing linen, and Jesus later is buried in linen. And so it could be another allusion could be the substitutionary aspect of Jesus' death, like the linen that was meant for humanity, Jesus took upon himself.
Yeah, right.
That's another thing.
Even I don't know if I'm taking it, but they seized him and he fled.
Yeah.
It was like Jesus, he was seized, but he willingly went with them.
Ooh, that's a good one. I'll tell Larry to add that to his version 2 of his commentary to add that. Yeah, that's actually so true. I didn't even pick that up. And James Edwards, he says, Mark leaving him unidentified appears to be intentional and purposeful because the young man represents all who flee in desperation when mayhem broke at the arrest of Jesus. So this particular story speaks for all present. His lack of identity also invites readers to examine their own readiness to abandon Jesus. Whoa. So essentially what James is saying is, hey, he's just a summary of every single person that fled Jesus, but he's also a picture for us to say, would we be ready to stand with Jesus if things came to hit the hammer like it happened here? And so, they're kind of like 3 different approaches or 3 different ways to look at the identity of the naked man, which I think is interesting.
Yeah.
I guess it's up to us to ponder and to think about the implications for us. But the story goes on, and so shall we. So Jesus is taken to the house of the high priest, but just before that, it kind of mentions in verse 54 that Peter followed him at a distance and right into the courtyard of the high priest. And so we have another Markan sandwich. So verse 54 is the beginning of the sandwich. It talks about Peter. Then it talks about what happens to Jesus in the house. And then at the end of chapter 14, it goes back to Peter and his eventual disowning of Jesus there. And so Jesus is taken to the high priest, and the high priest of the time is Caiaphas. And so there's already controversy around Caiaphas because Caiaphas is a high priest that is put in power by the Roman authorities. That is not something biblically that happened with the high priest, but the Roman authorities wanted to have such a hold on the Jewish religion and to show them that they had power that they assigned him to there. The true high priest of the time was actually a man named Ananias, and in the book of John, they actually take Jesus to Ananias first and then Caiaphas,
Right.
which is interesting. But yeah, Ananias was the high priest from around 6 to 15 AD, and Caiaphas was the high priest from around 18 to 36 AD. So even though Ananias wasn't the high priest at the time, he still had considerable weight because he was kind of the true high priest to the Jewish people.
Yep.
But, Caiaphas is kind of mentioned here because it's what happened with Caiaphas that eventually led to the death of Jesus. And so essentially what happens is they bring Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law come together, and essentially Jesus is put on trial in front of the Jewish authorities there. And so it's interesting, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death, but they couldn't find anything. And even the people that testified against Jesus, they didn't have testimonies that aligned with one another. And that's kind of just highlighting already Jesus' innocence in all of this. But I want to kind of talk a little bit about the trial itself, because James Edwards goes into a lot of detail about how the trial itself is a failure to uphold the justice in Israel. And so the Sanhedrin is the governing body of the Jewish people, and it consisted of 71 members. And the reason why the Sanhedrin existed is because observant Jews, they didn't want to honor the Gentile or the Roman occupation of Israel at the time. And the Roman administrators, they understood this. And so because of that, the Sanhedrin was kind of a buffer organization between the Jewish leaders in Rome and the Israelites of the day. Yeah. And so the Sanhedrin, they were kind of this tribe of Jews, like specialized Jews, that were able to mediate between the Jewish people and the Roman government. And, trials that related to, capital punishment and stuff were kind of gone through the Sanhedrin, which is super important. And they were based at the temple. And so according to the Mishnah, which is like the oral tradition, so in the Torah we have like the written law. The Mishnah was the oral tradition that was passed down as kind of like commentary on the written law, and eventually someone wrote that down too. It's ironic. Yep. But it says that in order for there to be a capital, in capital cases, in capital trials, there needs to be at least 23 members of the Sanhedrin there to be present, with reasons for the acquittal preceding the reasons for the conviction. And in capital cases, a guilty verdict required a second sitting the following day. So that's super important. So if someone, basically, first and foremost, there needed to be clear evidence that this person was guilty. Yep. And if that person was guilty according to the judgment of the Sanhedrin, then they had another trial basically the next day to kind of say, all right, were we right about this? Both sittings had to take place during the day, and neither of them could happen on a Friday or during a festival. And witnesses were warned against rumors and heresy, and a charge of blasphemy could not be sustained unless the accused cursed God's name itself, in which the punishment was death by stoning, and after they were killed by the stoning, their corpse was hung from a tree.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was pretty detailed in the Mishnah. And the reason why I wanted to kind of point this out is because none of those things actually happened for Jesus.
Oh.
Because his trial happened in the night. His trial happened on a Friday, the day before Sabbath, and his trial was happening during a festival, the Passover. So already, all the things that were required for this to be a worthy trial didn't actually occur.
Wow.
The major next thing that happened was, all right, they found him guilty, even though there was no clear evidence against him. They should have had a retrial the next day or a resitting the next day, and they didn't do that either. So this whole trial was a botch.
Yeah.
It was faked. It was just something that didn't follow any of the Jewish regulations or traditions or laws of the day, and it just goes to show how much they wanted to kill Jesus. Like how far they were willing to go to twist the laws, twist the traditions.
Dodgy.
Super dodgy. And something really interesting as well about the idea that they had false witnesses is the idea of giving false witness is breaking one of the 10 commandments, which is to not bear false witness. And according to the law in Numbers 35 and in Deuteronomy 17 and 19, if you had, in any case, there needed to be at least 2 witnesses, and those 2 witnesses needed to be able to complement one another and to be on the same track with one another. And in order for the witnesses to count and their voice to be, I guess, acknowledged in a trial. And these false witnesses, Mark goes out of his way to say none of them agreed with one another. So they were lying, and none of them were able to agree with one another. So all elements of this trial before the Sanhedrin was just flawed. Like they weren't upholding anything. And so the only thing that they were able to connect to Jesus and to make stick to Jesus was the fact that they said that, hey, he said that he was going to destroy the temple and then rebuild it, but not made with human hands. And so it's interesting, in the book of Mark, this is actually not recorded at all, that Jesus said anything like that. The only idea that the temple would be destroyed was what Jesus was talking about in Mark chapter 13, but Jesus himself didn't say that he was the one going to destroy it. He was kind of talking about the Roman government and how they would destroy it. But in the book of John, chapter 2, Jesus kind of talks a little bit about how he would the temple would be destroyed and he would build it up in 3 days. But the New Testament church knew that he wasn't talking about the physical temple being rebuilt. He was talking about his body, and his eventual resurrection too. So that's something to put out there. So after the kind of like throwing accusations against Jesus, Jesus was silent. And it's really important that Jesus was silent because he is kind of embodying the suffering servant role found in Isaiah chapter 53. In Isaiah chapter 53, verse 7, it says, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." The prophet Isaiah there, he's kind of talking about that future messianic suffering servant. And, Jesus is fully embodying everything that was prophesied about what this servant would do. He didn't say anything against his accusers. He kind of just stood there silently. Yep. Some people believe that it was a strategic thing, but, as Christians reading scripture, we can say, no, it wasn't just a strategic thing. It was he's fulfilling prophecy through what he was doing to kind of really show his identity to the world. And so it's interesting because the high priest basically was like, hey, are you not going to say anything? Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus finally responds in verse 62 and says, "I am," said Jesus, "and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." This is wild. I want to spend a little bit more time unpacking this because this is another pivot point in the chapter. It's a really important pivot point in the chapter as well. So basically, in the book of Mark, we have had this theme that we've kind of talked about already a little bit, called the Markan secret. So whenever anyone has asked about Jesus' identity or revealed his identity in some way, shape, or form, he's always asked them to keep it a secret. Yep. And it almost seems like Jesus was waiting for something to occur or waiting for a certain time in order to reveal his identity to people. And this is the point in the story where the secret is out, where it's no longer a secret to Jesus, for Jesus to keep about who he believes that he is. And he tells them, basically, yes, I am who you say I am. And it's interesting because, James Edwards says, until the question of the high priest, Jesus had steadfastly silenced all his proclamations of his divine sonship. In order to truly understand the meaning of his person, something had been missing. And the missing element was the element of the necessity of Jesus' suffering. So it was only when Jesus was in the midst of his suffering that he was able to fully reveal, this is who I am. And it was because Jesus was suffering and he was able to reveal who he is to everyone that was listening, that we were able to fully understand the heart of God and God's heart in all of this. And that's that even though we sinful humans that rebel against God, that he is willing to go through the fire to redeem us, which I think is really, really admirable and beautiful. And so in Jesus' answer, I want to break down 3 really important Old Testament allusions real quick. Jesus first and foremost says, I am. And so that's just not just like sorry, my English just didn't make sense. That is not just a statement of, oh yeah, no, I agree with what you're saying about me. Yeah. The Greek there is ego eimi. And for those Greek scholars, ego eimi is the Greek translation of Yahweh, essentially. And so Yahweh is the name that God revealed to Moses in Exodus chapter 3 about who he is, and that means I am who I am. And Yahweh is just a third person of that, which is he is who he is, essentially, or he is. Yep. And so what Jesus is doing here is he is essentially, when in response to the question of, hey, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus goes right in and says, I am, basically claiming divine sonship. He's basically saying, I am not just the Messiah, I am God. Like I am. And then he says, and you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One. That's an allusion to Psalm 110. And we kind of talked about Psalm 110 a few chapters ago because Jesus basically asked, that was at the end of chapter 12, I believe, when Jesus turns on the teachers of the law and says, all right, I got a question for you guys now. Why does David say in Psalm 110, hey, the Lord said to my Lord, come and sit down on my right hand? Jesus is alluding back to that again because he's kind of sharing his belief of his royal identity with the people of the Sanhedrin. And then he also says, you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of the Mighty One, coming on the clouds of heaven. That is an allusion to Daniel chapter 7, where in Daniel chapter 7, you have the Ancient of Days, and before the Ancient of Days, you have the Son of Man that is riding on a cloud, and all the power and authority and everything was given to this figure to be able to kind of like rule the world, essentially. And so in this like one sentence, Jesus is claiming that he's God, he's claiming he's the Messiah, and he's claiming that he is the person that's able to rule and judge the world.
That's a loaded sentence.
It's a loaded sentence. Hence why the high priest tore his clothes in verse 63, because it was just such a big, it was such a big thing that Jesus was claiming to be, that it was a blasphemous claim.
Yeah.
And so the high priest tore his clothes and said, why do we need any more witnesses? You've heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him as worthy of death. This idea that he was accused of blasphemy, James Edwards, he makes a really interesting point. It's often supposed that Jesus' claim to be the Messiah triggered the explosion from the high priest, but that is not the case. It was no crime to call oneself the Messiah or to be called so by others, for just as Justin Martyr, who was a scholar, an early church figure, later acknowledged, the Messiah would be only a man among men. So it's essentially what James Edwards is saying. Because Jesus called himself the Messiah in this sentence, that is not the reason why he got kind of condemned to die. The reason why he got condemned to die was because he claimed to be God, essentially.
Right.
He claimed to be the Son of God in this sentence by saying, you're going to see me seated on the right hand of God. He used the divine name, and that is why he is put to death. He's not put to death because he claims to be the king. He gets put to death because he claims to be divine. And that is the thing that puts him over the edge. So I think that's super important to know as we go on. And hence why the high priest tears his clothes. And so,
which was a sign of mourning. And
grief and anger, all of the intense emotions, essentially.
Yeah. We don't do that today, but very common.
And it would have been super expensive to tear your clothes because clothes weren't cheap.
True, especially for a priest. They had
special clothes.
Ooh.
Yeah.
A costly maneuver.
Very costly maneuver.
Very emotional. Yep.
Very emotional. And so in verse 65, some begin to spit at Jesus. They blindfold him. They strike him with their fists and they say, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him up. And that's, again, an allusion back to Isaiah chapter 50, talking about that suffering servant again, because in Isaiah 50 verse 6, it talks about how this suffering servant is going to be mistreated and whatnot. So all of the Old Testament pictures of the suffering servant, the Messiah, the Son of God, this royal king, are all coming together in this story. in Jesus now.
Yep.
And in verse 66, we come back to the Peter sandwich, and we're looking back at Peter again.
Back at the bread.
Back at the bread. And it's really interesting to compare, Jesus' steadfast resolution about his identity to Peter's just flailing of who he believes that Jesus, or who he claims to be in relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
And so, Peter is standing in the courtyard, and one of the servant girls of the high priest recognizes Peter, and she says, hey, you're with him. You're one of those guys that were with Jesus. And he denies that. And he says, I don't know or understand what you are talking about. And so basically, if you look at the Greek for the idea of not knowing or not understanding, it's both like an intellectual thing and an experiential thing, like the words that are used there. And so essentially, Peter is denying intellectually and experientially to know who Jesus is. So it's like a full denial.
Yeah.
And he goes and he moves and he goes out into the entryway, and the entryway is a little bit further from where Jesus is, and it's kind of like a symbol of his continual walking away from Christ. Yeah. And then again, he gets told like, hey, no, you're one of them. And he begins to call down curses, and he swore to them. One thing here, the translation of the Greek of Jesus swearing on them, it could mean that it could mean that he's like cursing, but it could also mean that he's like swearing on the name of like God, like the way that the Greek
of Peter swearing on. You said Jesus.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Peter.
Okay, my bad. Swearing on. Yep.
And James Edwards makes a point of like, if Peter was like swearing on the name of God that he didn't know Jesus, that's even worse than swearing in general, because he's like he's like making like hectic claim and saying like, I swear to God. Like essentially what Peter's saying, like, I swear to God, I don't know this guy.
Yeah. And
that just makes his betrayal even worse than Judas's betrayal, because Judas didn't pretend to not know Jesus.
Right.
But Peter, he's just flat out denying experientially and relationally who Jesus is, and intellectually who Jesus is, and he's like swearing on God's name, like, I promise you, I don't know who this guy is. Yeah. And after all that happens, the rooster crows, and Peter remembers that, he made that claim that he wouldn't. And the book of Luke, I think it's Luke that does it even more sadly. Like, as soon as the rooster crows, Jesus looks at Peter, and Peter's like, oh, no, and like weeps bitterly. Yeah. And it's just. Yeah, and it says here in verse 72, he broke down and wept too. And so I like what James Edwards has to say. He says that, the fact that Peter includes, like, Peter is obviously one of the disciples that gives Mark a lot of the content for his gospel. Yep. And the fact that Peter includes his betrayal in such a detailed way to Mark only kind of shows the authenticity of the gospel. Because if you were trying to build a religion or trying to share like a movement, you would only want to show the best of people. Yep. But Peter just kind of shows like, this is how broken and bad I was. Yeah. But Jesus still accepts and loves me. And I like his application of essentially the end of this chapter. He says the church can be honest about sin, even the sins of an apostate apostle, because it is so convinced of grace. And he quotes Romans chapter 5, verse 20, where it says, where sin increased, grace increased all the more. And I think chapter 14, it finishes on this beautiful note of remembrance that, yes, Peter did deny Jesus, but the reason why we know Peter denied Jesus is because Peter was accepted by Jesus again and restored by Jesus again, and Peter was able to share his story and to share it in the light of the grace and love that was shown to him. And so I just want to encourage, before I hand it back over to you, just pastorally, just to remember, you are never too far away from the grace of God. Like even Peter himself, who promised to stand by Jesus and was shaken down by a little girl, was able to be redeemed and used by Jesus to do amazing things in the book of Acts, and his legacy is 2,000 years old. So just be encouraged, be of good cheer. But that's me. That's me for today. I'm going to hand it over to you.
And you don't have to hide your brokenness. Like, you being honest and transparent about it is actually what can give strength to others, because it gives a moment to say, this is how weak and broken I was, but look how strong like God has worked through me anyway.
Yep.
Yeah, what a cool thing. Yeah, I never thought about the story like that. Thank you so much for sharing. That's awesome. Well, yeah, let's dive into the last 20 verses. So then we get the second part of the trial. This is like the Gentile part of it.
Yeah.
So this is when Jesus gets handed over to like the Roman government. And it's totally different. The Jewish one is very like, there's like a committee or whatever, they decide together. Roman is just like Pilate makes the call and that's it. It doesn't matter. So total opposite. But what's interesting is that like, so David Garland in the application commentary, he says like a Roman governor would not have put a native Jew on trial for his life simply because he has violated Jewish religious regulations. Like to the Romans, they did not really care that much about the Jewish regulations. So that's why the charge against Jesus must have been shaped a bit differently. That's why like the first thing Pilate asks him is, are you the king of the Jews? Like he's not really looking at the religious issues here. He's just looking at like, is this like a revolution against the
like
Roman
a political
Empire?
thing.
Yeah, so that's what they've kind of changed the charge, you know? Like to them, they put him on trial because he used God's name in vain, right? Kind of, and he said that he was God. Whereas to Pilate, the issue is that like, oh, this guy's king of the Jews.
Yep.
So it's like he's getting tried on two different things, which is super weird.
Yep.
So again, it's kind of the mess of what the Sanhedrin did. And it's interesting. So the governor wouldn't really have cared that much. So the high priest reformulate the charge against Jesus in a way that the Roman governor will understand and have to take it seriously. Since Pilate's first question is, are you the king of the Jews? Presumably this is the official charge against Jesus. If Jesus claims to be king, he's guilty of a crime against the sovereign power of Rome. Sending him to Pilate in tethers also insinuates that he is a threat to public order. So, like, it's pretty interesting. So, like, they bound him up to make him look like more of a threat than what he actually was.
Yeah.
But, like, he never threatened anybody. Like, well, except for one of his disciples cut some dude's ear off, you know, like, which is really Mark doesn't talk about Jesus healing the dude's ear back on. Like,
which gospel does that? I know one of them.
One of them does. I don't. Maybe Luke. I'm not sure. I should check that. But yeah, I was like, did Mark not care about that part of the story? I don't know. Like he's like, oh, don't bother writing that part down. Like, talk about that naked guy. You know. Like, I don't know. You know. It's kind of interesting. Anyway, and also the Romans reserved the power of the sword for themselves. This is Ben Witherington III. The most Sanhedrin could do was to hand Jesus over unless they resorted to vigilante justice, like stoning him.
Yep.
But if they stoned Jesus, it would have been more of a private affair, not sanctioned by the state or witnessed by a large crowd before the tribunal. If the point was to eliminate Jesus in the most public and shameful way possible, so as to stamp out the Jesus movement, then the Romans must be involved. If they wanted legal action, which made Jesus a lawbreaker and a troublemaker, the Romans must act. Thus, the Jewish authorities proceeded in the way they did. So it's very political. It's kind of like the prequel Star Wars movies. It's like all this action, but mixed in with this like politics to help it make sense. I'm sorry, was that too niche a reference?
I'm like, I wasn't expecting Star Wars to be thrown in there. That's so
I can't help it.
funny.
I can't help it. So that's why he's in this sort of position. But question is, who was Pontius Pilate? So he was, I didn't know this before reading this, he was the equestrian class, like a knight.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which means he had some property, but, it wasn't like the big dogs.
Yep.
So knights were used to govern the small and sometimes more troublesome areas of the empire, and Pilate ruled from AD 26 to 36.
Yep.
But what's interesting is he would not have lived in this area at all. He would have been out in like Caesarea. But he would have been sent here because of this Jewish festival that was about to happen.
Right.
Because there were going to be heaps more people in town, you wouldn't want like a revolution or something to start or some sort of uprising. So he goes to this place to keep the peace there.
Yep.
Which is why he's very hesitant to do anything with Jesus, because like he doesn't want to upset the crowds. Because this is prime time for revolution to start. Like you've got Passover coming up, you've got all of these thousands of extra people coming to town. Like if this thing goes haywire, it could be a total mess.
Yep.
So that's why like the dude is a straight up politician. That's what he's doing. He's just controlling the situation, trying to make it like as undisturbing as possible. However, he also did not seem to get on with the Jewish leaders very well. I won't read you guys the whole story. I'll just give like the summary of it. But in Josephus, who is a historian, his full name's Flavius Josephus, which I just think is so cool. So the works of Josephus, the complete and unabridged version, there's a paragraph about a bit about like explaining who Pilate was and his relationship with the Jews, particularly Jewish leaders. So he used temple funds to pay for an aqueduct.
Dog.
Yeah. So that was like not okay with the Jewish leaders. So they were really upset about it. And so they all like got hundreds of people to come and like kind of, I don't know if protest is the right word, but they're trying to get him to like, hey, like you can't use our funds for this. So they were all in this like courtyard complaining. And so he got a bunch of soldiers to dress up like Jews and to mix him with the crowd. And then once they started complaining, the soldiers were meant to just sort of rip out and just start beating them up.
Oh my gosh.
But then the soldiers went a bit too out of control and ended up killing like heaps of them.
No way.
But not Josephus, Pilate wasn't really that fazed because to him he was just like the crowd dispersed and he was like, issue solved. So this is the kind of guy.
He is.
kind of guy we're talking about. So yeah, there's probably part of this where he's like, doesn't want to mess things up because there's a bit of tension already. But also I think he also kind of like to annoy the Jewish leaders a little bit. So kind of interesting guy, I think. I would love to know more, but we're limited by history here.
Yeah.
So anyway, going about this system, this is the moment when Jesus is meant to, like anybody in this position where you're before Pilate or whoever in the Roman system, this is where you beg for your life and you make it like you give your case. Like you got one person to sell your case to, that's it. If you're convinced that person, you're in the clear. Way harder with the Sanhedrin because it's like a huge council, with witnesses and that kind of thing. None of that matters here. You just have to convince Pilate you're not worth killing.
Yeah.
Right? That's all he had to do. But he didn't. This is why Pilate gets so confused. Well, not confused, but sort of surprised.
Yeah.
So they bound him and then he asked him to be the king of the Jews. And then Jesus says, well, you've said so. That's it. So there's some interesting commentary around this too. They reckon the reason Jesus didn't flat out, well, he didn't deny it because he is kind of the king of the Jews, right? But he also didn't say yes because that could also be kind of problematic too. Like there's how he answered it, he had to be very careful with his answer, as Jesus always seems to be, because there's also the risk he had of throwing the Jewish leaders under the bus and a whole lot of them getting killed because of them bringing like a bad court case or whatever.
Yeah, okay.
Like an untrue one and wasting Pilate's time.
Yeah, because if you'd said no, then...
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So, yeah, lots of like interesting nuances to this that it's kind of hard to capture in the story, I guess.
Yeah.
And some which we're guessing too. We're guessing all these links too. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, aren't you going to answer? See how many things you're being accused of? So this is the part where he's like, come on, man, like this is the moment to plead the case. But Jesus made no reply. And Pilate was amazed. Because this would have been the polar opposite to everybody else who comes before him would have been begging, Jesus didn't do anything, just stood there. Now, it says here that it was a custom at the festival to release a prisoner. There's actually not much historical evidence, not evidence, but like it seems like a bit, it's not really mentioned in many places that this was like a custom.
Yep.
So maybe this was like a one-off custom that Pontius Pilate was just like, hey, let's make this a thing.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't know, wasn't much of a thing. There were times when the Roman governments would do royal pardons or whatever though, so that's not unheard of. So a man named Barabbas, who was Barabbas? So John Dibdale, he says it's possible that he was a member of the violent Jewish party called the Zealots. So the rebellion mentioned in Mark is unknown in other sources, but apparently well known in Palestine. So this dude is a straight up criminal. He's like insurrectionists, murdered people.
Yep.
Pretty straightforward.
Bad guy.
Bad guy. And that's why like he's up for crucifixion because he's probably like murdered Romans and that kind of thing. Like trying, you know what I mean? Like he's not, it's a totally different ballgame to what Jesus is about. Like this guy is like literally trying to like overthrow the Roman Empire. He's probably like the perfect candidate to be crucified.
Yep.
Right? So the crowd came up to Pilate to do for them as he usually did. And asked, so they were like, hey, like, this is your thing. You release someone, like, let's do it a thing. So he's like, do you want me to release you King of the Jews? Or what about this dude Barabbas? So they're like, okay, straight up criminal or dude who doesn't really seem like that big a deal. So, yeah. It's interesting here that it says the chief priest stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead.
Yeah.
Like, they're full on manipulating the situation. I've had friends, I couldn't really, I tried to look this up, but I've had friends who've been to the Bible Lands, like to like trips and stuff. I've never been. I would love to go. But they said the area where they suspect that this happened, they said it's actually quite a small courtyard.
Right.
And they reckon only like, it would have been like majority in that courtyard would have been chief priests.
Yeah. Okay.
Just from what they could see, like they would have been like, so when it says the crowd, it's really just meaning those religious leaders.
Yeah.
And there's a few people from the crowd there. It was hard to confirm. Like I tried to read things, so that's just on my friends' eyewitness accounts. But you know, to me, I'm like, it matches the story. It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, they stir up the crowd. And then Pilate, it's kind of a dangerous move for him to turn the final decision about Jesus to the crowd. He might have been wanting to like annoy the religious leaders because, again, he kind of doesn't like them. They kind of annoyed him, but they all ended up crying out for like Barabbas to be released instead. And he indicates in verse 14 he didn't really see any evil in Jesus or his deeds, at least not sufficient for the extreme punishment being clamoured for. But again, Pilate is a politician. He doesn't want to have a mob, an angry mob around like this festival time. So he's like, okay. So to satisfy the crowd, releases Barabbas and hands over Jesus to be crucified. Yeah, pretty crazy, really. Like, I don't know. I think we've read the story people read the story so much that they just like, they don't really think much about it. But it's really like huge injustices going on here.
Yeah. So many.
And it says he handed him over to be flogged and then crucified. Not to go into too much gory detail here, I guess, but flogging in and of itself could actually be lethal just on his own. Ben Witherington III, he writes it very tastefully, so I'll just read. Flogging itself could produce death, for it was the dreaded flagellum, which I'm probably not pronouncing right, but that's just what we got, which had bits of lead and bone tied to it, or even hooks that could tear stuff off the bone of the victim. So since such torture could go on indefinitely, many criminals died just from the flogging before they went to the cross. So it's not uncommon practice if the person was dealt with. It was an uncommon practice if the person to be dealt with was a non-Roman. The point was to inflict pain and further humiliate the victim. So this is like very serious stuff. And then he goes on and he gets mocked by the soldiers as well. So purple was a traditional colour of royalty in those cultures. Something interesting as well, the Phoenicians had originally been the traders because they could make this purple dye from shellfish.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was kind of hard to come by. So, but they just used it to mock Jesus. So,
wow.
And then Hellenistic kings used to wear a laurel wreath on their heads. But Lane, he suggests that the crown of thorns made of the acanthus bush or of palm spines was meant to emulate the famous many-pointed diadem or crowns. So, clearly to mock him. Thorns would have been just brutal. I don't know. I grew up on a farm, so we had box thorns, which were like so long and hard they could pierce tractor tires.
Whoa.
These thorns are kind of similar to the ones that they mentioned here. So look massive, like as long as your finger kind of thorns, like just massive, So this is a very we see pictures and descriptions of Jesus being crucified, and he often kind of looks like it's been hard, but he's still got his face is still intact. And he's kind of looking up to heaven, the blood trickling down the side. Like really, Jesus would have been beaten beyond recognition. There would have been so much blood and, just like so much that had gone on with him. You wouldn't even be able to recognize the guy. You'd barely be able to recognize him as a person. Yeah. So we need to not read this story and just gloss over the pain that he went through, that an innocent man went through.
This is really the hell. Like, this is hell, really.
Yeah. That humans would do this to a fellow human in the first place, you know? Like, this is a standard Roman practice, and they're putting someone through it who didn't even deserve it. But the fact that Romans had to come up with this, like, that's a sinful nature in people right there.
Yep.
That, like, this is ground zero opposite of Eden. You know, it is like the only thing they were out to do is inflict as much pain on someone as possible.
Yep.
Eden is meant to be you're giving blessings in life as much as possible. This is hell.
Yep.
This is so far removed from the kind of life that God wants. So, but the thing is, Barabbas makes a kind of beautiful picture here, because he was the one who is meant to go, who's perfect candidate to go on the cross, and yet he walks free. There's never even any mention of Barabbas turning around, like, and thanking Jesus. You never hear of him again.
Yeah.
Dude walks free. Might have just gone straight back to being an insurrectionist and murderer after this. We have no idea. I like to think that maybe he saw Jesus on the cross and had a heart to, but we have no idea what happened. But that's the thing. This gift of Jesus on the cross, it's a free gift to everybody, whether they accept it or not. It's a free gift. Obviously, you know, when we choose to accept it and receive his life, it leads to that abundant life. But really, the gift, it's ready and available for everybody. And even someone like Barabbas, who totally deserved it, totally deserved the punishment coming, could still have the total opportunity to be forgiven freely.
Yeah.
So where really Barabbas is a picture of us as the human race. We're that picture of Barabbas, and that we're the ones who deserved the sin and shame and punishment of sin. But instead, we receive life and freedom. And Jesus took the punishment for our sin.
Yeah. It's interesting, hey, because even though the situation here is the opposite of Eden, what Jesus is doing is what will re-bring Eden to the world again.
Wow. Selfless and sacrificial love is what brings Eden. Yeah. Well, that's a pretty good note to finish on, I think.
I was like, do I have anything else?
No, I don't want to add anything to that. That's perfect. Do you want to do a reflection question each?
Yeah, sure.
Just start us off.
For me, I don't have any specific aspect of this passage I wanted to focus on. I more wanted to encourage people just to take a meta reflection and just say, man, think about everything that Jesus is going through right now. His unjust trial, betrayal from his friends, being deserted by the people that promised to be there with him, and then just excruciating physical torture. How does it feel to know that Jesus did that so that you didn't have to experience that for yourself? He did that for you.
Yeah, well. My question is, what are you doing with your freedom in Christ? You got freedom? What are you going to do with it?
Yeah, wow, that's actually a crazy question, because we have freedom because he didn't.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay, I'm going to think about that. Right, let's stop this podcast so I can think about it.
Well, luckily we're at the end. This is the perfect time to think about it.
All right. Well, on that note, we just want to thank you so much for joining us on this podcast journey. This is episode 23. We got 3 more to go, which is just 2 more to go, which is just mind-blowing. And we just pray that you continue to see the world the way that God wants you to see it. And if this podcast has helped you to see things differently or to understand things differently, feel free to leave a like, or feel free to leave a review, or to share it with other people, because we'd love this to add value to as many people as possible. But we just pray that you may continue to see things God's way, and to understand, you know, how to have those Garden of Eden moments more in your life by seeing the grace of Jesus in everything. And I just want to encourage everyone, even though we kind of ended on some really, really sad things, you know, the next couple of podcasts are going to pick us back up on a high, and to remind us why the Christian message, the Christian gospel is good news, and why we actually worship Jesus. So stay tuned with us. We only have 2 more left until we finish our Mark journey, and it ends on a high. So we will see you next week, and bye for now.